Hey, Push It's Mr. Imatsu here. Coming to you with activity number 7. Excuse me. We're talking about the Great Depression and the New Deal. So we already talked in our last one about about Hoover, and Hoover was the president in charge during the fall of the stock market, and that kind of is the beginning of multiple events that kind of lead us into something called the Great Depression. That day that the stock market went down was called Black Tuesday. And we'll kind of talk about those causes as well and some of the effects that were happening as well. So let's get into it and take a look at this. There's this article on Britannica.com that I kind of saw, and I thought this would be kind of a cool thing to review for you guys. So the first thing is the stock market crash of 1929. Basically, at this time, these things called stock, and there's been probably a lot of kind of headlines recently about this because we did have a little bit of like a mini crash here in March of 2020. But the stock market crashed at that time in 1929 due to the fact that stock prices were just going up so high. And people were investing a lot of money into the stock market and investing in companies that really weren't producing things, or they're kind of make believe producing things, or they're producing so much of this stuff that it wasn't even being bought. And even though they weren't making any money, people would buy their stock because the stock price would go up. So a stock is a piece of the company. You can think of it like that. And people are buying so many pieces of this that the demands for that piece of paper was going up really, really high. People were basically taking loans out, not even using their own hard saved money to invest, but actually taking just loans from the bank and hoping to pay bank back the loan back to the bank with the profits of the stock market. So the stock market was what we call a very inflated bubble. A lot of people had put money on into it that they expect to get money back, and when it started to go down and people started to freak out that they might not have the money to pay back their loans, they began selling, and this selling kind of caused the fall of the stock market. It talks about how this crash went down almost 90%, which is really, really a crazy amount of loss at that time. And so at that time, if you did have money in the stock market and you were using this and you had that money that you put into the stock market because you took a loan from the bank, you now lost a lot of money and you now own the bank a loan. And this kind of spurred into the next thing, which was banking panics and monetary contraction. So due to the stock market crash, and not only individuals but also banks were also investing money into the stock market as well. They lost money, and so all this money is just getting flushed out because the prices of things just began to fall, and everybody started taking their money out of the banks and out of stocks. Well, the banks even have money to give to their own customers inside of their banks because they had also put it, and people began trying to take it out. So if you're one of the first customers, you probably were able to take a lot of your own money out. But if you're one of the middle to last customers, you came to a bank that actually had lost all your money. They didn't have it in reserves at that time. There were no rules about that. And so they began to actually fail. And there were no insurance at this time. So people who had their savings in these banks began losing all of their money. And as that began happening, people began saving their money and not putting into banks, which stopped the flow of money. And so when the movement of money begins to slow down, that's called monetary contraction, where money's not being passed, but people are just holding it in, or there's not enough money out there, either being printed or people that want it, or it's maybe not even worth it. What happens is that also caused the economy to begin shrinking and going down. And when we say shrinking, it's just people aren't spending things. And so if you had a job of doing something, people don't want to spend money on that luxury item anymore. Maybe you're, an artist or something. Maybe they're not spending money on that specific art piece anymore because they're more concerned about smaller items like food and everything else. So it's not like everybody lost their jobs, but 1 out of 4 people did lose their jobs at this time. And then we've seen in previous things like specific areas. For instance, in 2008, when there was a banking crisis, there was a lot of banks that had lost jobs and they had defaulted and had to, basically fire all of their employees. But that was specific just to banking. Other parts of our economy, if you're in other parts of it, you weren't nearly as affected. So, um, so that was no reason. Another thing is, well, the gold standard is something that they can talk about. Gold standard limits the amount of money that you can produce because you have to have a certain amount of gold in your pocket to produce a certain number of bills. So when something like this happens, if you want to produce more money very quickly to give the people to spend, you can't do that because you're only limited to the amount of gold that you have. Currently, we're not on that system, and actually, after the Great Depression, we're going to move the entire world into this kind of like more of a make believe system called the fiat system, and where the United States is kind of the world's reserve currency, the dollar. And so, this is why when you guys go trade things around the world, a lot of times they compare it to the dollar. And so that's because after World War II, really the only strong financial banking sector that is there is the United States, who really didn't incur any type of warfare on its soil. Where most of Pacific had gotten, involved in war, and most of Europe obviously had been devastated for war. So after this, we're going to get rid of the gold standard because we're so limited in producing money. And today, we're definitely doing something that John Maynard Keynes, that we'll talk about in a second, would love, by just trying to take money from the government, produce money, and give it to the people to stimulate the economy, have them start buying things. And so we'll talk about that in a second, especially in our current time with the election of President Biden and the Congress now promising $2,000 stimulus checks to citizens of the United States of a certain tax bracket. One last thing, and I'll kind of show this actually in a map. But was like kind of the end of the rotation of lending and tariffs. As this happened, there are also other parts of the world that were invested in the United States as well. And because they were invested in the United States, when the stock market crashed, it also affected them. There are also Germany at this time, if you remember, had to pay reparations to France and Great Britain, and France and Great Britain had to pay back loans back to the United States. So what the United States basically had done is they had began giving money to Germany, and Germany was paying them back for reparations, and these guys were paying back the loans. So, and then we would make, JP Morgan would make money on interest by loaning it to Germany. So if you think about it, JP Morgan in the United States was making money off of Great Britain, France, and Germany because they're all paying percents back and interest back to the United States. At a grander scale, what happens is the United States begins, and all their banks begin contracting, and this kind of flow of money that has been going over here stops. And when all these flows of money begin stopping, going to the United States back to Germany, then we're seeing the shrinking of the economy. So that kind of happened at a larger scale. Also, each government in each country, and the United States as well, began putting on protective tariffs, right? Trying to stop people from trading with other countries and buy their own goods. Well, this just actually made things kind of even worse at a global level, where we couldn't kind of get goods and services from one another. The idea is that if another place can do something better and cheaper than you can, then you should try to buy it from them. And that's what makes economies efficient. When you start putting on protective tariffs and people aren't buying and selling things based off of how good they are and how cheap they are, but rather just where they're located, you begin to get some economic inefficiencies, and that kind of causes some problems as well. So that's what this is talking about regarding international lending and tariffs and people paying taxes on one another. Despite all these causes, and the effects are going to be massive, 1 out of 4 people are going to be unemployed. The output of the economy is going to go down. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to come up, and I'm going to say that he's going to take Harding and his ideas and just make them much stronger. Hoover. Hoover kind of had a voluntary principle, like people should, hey, you guys should do this, but didn't really force it. FDR is going to come much stronger. Some are going to compare him almost to like a slight dictator, the way in which he's trying to control the economics and ensure that his ideas are passed. There's a court packing scheme with the Supreme Court in which he tries to put more members, just add more members to the Supreme Court, so that they would vote in favor of his laws because they were being found unconstitutional by the current Supreme Court. So there's a lot of, FDR is heralded as one of the biggest presidents, one of the strongest presidents, most important presidents. But Khan Academy does a good job to deconstruct him, and he does rise to make decisions. He does show leadership, and he does get most of the United States to kind of unify under these ideas. But there are some moments and some flaws into his history. We can't just celebrate him as this historical figure that was able to do all these items. And I think Khan Academy does a good job about that, and we'll talk about that here. Um, the New Deal, whether it be the first or the second, kind of had these thing called the three R's that a lot of historians point to, that a lot of AP students will use to pass tests. And it's the idea that everything you pass had to focus on relief to help people with the depression, whether it be unemployment, whether it be the food lines, whether it be losing their homes, like try to get government to give them stuff to make it a little bit easier. Recovery, how do we actually get businesses going? How do we reopen these banks? How do we go ahead and spur our economy to start growing like it used to get this thing going? And then reform, what are we going to do to banks, the stock market, to trade, to tariffs? What are we going to do in the future to make sure that this economic problem that started kind of largely in the United States, and you can see in large the world, but it did start in the United States, became a worldwide phenomenon and become such a big problem we couldn't get ourselves out of. So as you guys go through Khan Academy, you're going to see some of the reforms, some of the recovery, and some of the relief, and that's what I ask you to do in your activity. But a lot of teachers call it like the alphabet soup of things. You're going to see the TWA or the TVA, excuse me, the NRA, the National Recovery Act. There's all these acronyms that are out there that FDR passes, but they largely fall into those three groups. And that's what you need to know for the test. I don't think you need to know very specific actions, but you need to know how what he was doing was trying to end these certain issues. One guy that he would celebrate this would be John Maynard Keynes, which was different than Adam Smith. Remember, the first kind of like economic philosophy we see to embrace, like most of the world, is mercantilism. And then during the Gilded Age and up until now, this laissez-faire, Adam Smith, hands-off, let government do as much as it can approach. John Maynard Keynes has kind of a different approach, which is this kind of hands-on and hands-off to the entire economy and therefore business when appropriate. So John Maynard Keynes would look at what we're doing now with this current recession that we're going through and this economic crisis that we're going through, and it would applaud us. He'd be really happy that we are using as much money as we can right now to encourage people to go buy things. So, we've heard about this $2,000 stimulus check. Like, one thing my brother's going to do is go get a surfboard, and that's going to stimulate the economy because now that surfboard shaper and that surfboard shop is going to make a little money. Those individuals are going to be able to pay their employees. Those employees are going to be able to go to Target, right? And the Target employees now get money, and they're going to be able to go to restaurants, and you get it. Like, this economic flow keeps on going. In times of economic shock, people stop spending things and they start contracting and saving things. That keeps the flow of money not going. And so he would applaud things like this, and he'd applaud what Franklin Delano Roosevelt was doing, which was trying to spend money to get people not to be unemployed and on the streets, but try to create government jobs to get them employed, and then eventually slowly get rid of those unemployment jobs, or those jobs that the government was using for the unemployed. John Maynard Keynes would say that, ultimately, if you have to cut taxes every time to make things easier, that's awesome. But he understood that government most likely in these spending scenarios in which we're just making this money and just giving this money out, that we go into further debt. And he argued that at times of economic prosperity, when things got better after these bad times had happened and people were doing well, you would increase taxes to pay back those items and have what we call a balanced budget. But he understood that there are times in which the government would need to spend more than it currently had and go into debt just to support its economy. And that would be much better than have the economy fail for a shorter time that would go longer, or even the long term for an extended amount of time and maybe never fully recover, which would be even more horrible, right? So that was kind of his view. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a great example of, and the current Democrats as well, of individuals that would believe in this kind of this view of what's going on. Largely, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Keynesian economics, and the New Deal can be seen kind of largely as a failure. Really, economically, it really wasn't doing it what it should have, and we were increasing our debt time year after year. most historians will definitely credit the World War II actually be the thing that got America out of the Great Depression. Once again, fighting in Europe and fighting across the world will put America right in the center as a neutral power. And a lot of the world will depend, whether it be the Japanese for our oil or, the British and French for our goods and our ships and our armaments to fight a war. And we're going to claim neutrality during this time and basically be the shopping the store of the world as people need things to fight this war. Obviously, we'll enter the war in 1941, but this is a full 2 years before full war and before at least 3 or 4 years for a ramp up of war. Hitler goes on a larger siege that takes much longer time than just World War II and America's entrance into World War II. And it's only the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by the Japanese, who happen to be allied with Nazi Germany, that really draws us into World War II. I think we would have been staying out much longer. So, just as a heads up, that's kind of a little bit of a criticism of Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, again, an individual that is quite prized in American history, kind of looked up upon as a very strong president, and I would agree as well. But a lot of times he is credited with his New Deal as being a person that created some awesome programs that helped us get out of the Great Depression, and some historians would argue not. Nonetheless, parts of the New Deal that he did create, we still have today: unemployment, some of the banking reforms, stock market, Security and Exchange Commission, which kind of regulates the stock market, Social Security for the elderly to ensure that they have a retirement. So a lot of the things that he created, we still have today, and are hallmarks of actually both parties now, if you think about it, especially like a thing called Medicare. Both parties have kind of taken on these things. The Republicans at one time would have rejected these items as kind of larger welfare laws and agreements and programs. But even they now it's become woven within the fabric of society that everybody gets Social Security, that everybody gets Medicare, and a lot of these other items that kind of started under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So he definitely has a strong legacy here in the United States. One more thing I want to do off the side, just to let you know, because you guys talk about this, is the polio. That he contracts polio, which is kind of an interesting thing, that he's paralyzed from the waist down, and they make an agreement with the press not to ever photograph him. So during most of his presidency, most of the common American did not know that he could not use the bottom of his legs. The projection of weakness, he didn't want that. He wanted the projection of strength. So that's one reason. And just an interesting side fact, that's something actually my grandfather suffered from as well. He contracted polio at a young age as well, and he was paralyzed from his waist down as well. So I have a little personal history with that disease, which there's a vaccine campaign to end it, which was quite successful to eradicate polio, which they did in the 1940s and largely 1950s, I believe. All right, guys. Well, that's our kind of review of the Great Depression and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's response to that and the New Deal. And we'll see you in the next one, which is a ramp up to World War II. All right. Take care now. Bye.